Hi, welcome to Talking Books and Stuff, the program that talks all about books and writing and stuff. Here's your host, Dennis Rimmer.
Welcome back. It's yet another edition of Talking Books and Writing and Stuff, and today we're talking about all of that when we talk to Derek Hayes from out on the west coast of BC, and the book in front of me is, wow, I'm speechless, I'm gobsmacked. It's called Incredible Crossings, The History and Art of the Bridges, Tunnels, and Inland Ferries that Connect British Columbia. And having grown up and spent many years in British Columbia, the lower mainland especially, I know a lot about bridges and tunnels and ferries and stuff like that. So, Derek Hayes, thank you very much for being with us today.
Oh, you're very welcome. Thank you for having me.
You're welcome. Now, this book, The Incredible Crossings, The History and Art of the Bridges, Tunnels, and Ferries of British Columbia, what was the inspiration for that? Because I understand you've done a number of previous books, mainly about geography and maps. So why a book about bridges and tunnels?
Oh, well, yeah, no, I've done other books as well, not just maps and stuff, but like my last book was Iron Road West, which was a history of the railways of British Columbia. But the inspiration, if you want to call it that, of this particular book was basically something to do during COVID.
Oh, boy.
So I was already writing. I was researching a book on high-speed trains, and I was booked in March of 2020 to go to Japan to do part of the research of that. When, of course, COVID hit, and so I couldn't go, and so I was looking for something to do, basically, and it turned out, of course, that you could travel within the province by the summer of 2020, so I thought of doing this book, and what it was it was intended, like I've been taking photos of books. I've been taking photos of bridges for many years because I like the architecture, the curves and the lines and so on from a photographic point of view. And so I thought, I could put the history of some of these bridges together with the art of them, the photos that I consider to be somewhat artistic at least, and create a book out of it that might be of interest to some people. So I did a couple of tours actually over a couple of summers, 2020 and 2021, around BC to make up the things that I didn't have, basically fill in the gaps, and put it together as this book.
And it's a spectacular book. It's I guess you would call it a collector's item, a coffee table book, full color pictures and illustrations. You've got a shot in here on page 23 of some graffiti down by the Vancouver Harbor, the Burrard Bridge from the Hornby Street ferry dock, as I just flipped through it.
Of course, graffiti is one of those things. There's a big debate about it at the moment as to whether or not it's art or just simply defacing. And I take the view that it depends on what it is and where it is. And these particular photos that I were taking were of ones that struck graffiti that struck me as art, that were on the concrete piers of a couple of bridges, and the play of light and shade managed to make them into quite a nice image, I felt.
Yep.
You could argue that it was defacing the pier, I suppose, but I don't think in these cases it was. I think it was beautifying them.
That's right. And we're talking about bridges, tunnels, and ferries. So I was around in the 50s, late 50s, when they had the big collapse of what is now the Iron Workers Bridge. Do you have a history or something to tell us about that incident?
Yeah, well, of course, the collapse of the bridge when it was under New Bridge, Second Narrows Bridge, as it was called then, collapsed in 1958, killing 18 workers on it because of a miscalculation by one of the engineers involved, where he had miscalculated the load that was able to be taken by one of the temporary structures that held up the arch before it was connected at the other end. And it was, of course, a tragedy at that time, and that is why a little later it was renamed the Ironworkers Memorial Second Narrows Bridge, or Second Narrows Crossing, actually, technically. But of course, it's always, and there's plaques on the end, with the names of the workers that died on it.
And that's the, as you said, the Second Narrows Crossing, we'll call it for brevity's sake. Lionsgate Bridge, they built it, 1936, 1935?
Yes, in the late 30s, and it that was, of course, the first bridge in that location. The Second Narrows Bridge there was one before that had been built in 1925 that carried both road and rail across it. But the problem was that every time a train came, the traffic got held up. So that's and of course the bridge opened too. The 1925 bridge originally had what's called a bascule a bridge as part of it, which means it's got a big weight on one end, and one part of it just sort of tips up based on the weight at the other end. But the problem was with that is that the opening was too far over to one side, and so ships kept crashing into it, and eventually in 1930 it crashed into it so bad the bridge was closed for 4 years. And then they rebuilt it with a lift in the middle, rather than this bascule arrangement at one side, and that seemed to work better and wasn't replaced until with the Second Narrows for road in 1958, and the railway was replaced in 1970 when CN took it over and built a huge tunnel through the immediately. Like the train comes off of the bridge and goes into a tunnel immediately called the Thornton Tunnel that takes it to connect to the main line from north. So they can transfer trains from North Vancouver to their main line. And that tunnel is kind of interesting because it has a ventilation shaft in the middle of it that comes up in the middle of a residential area in Burnaby that is disguised as a house, disguised as a normal house. And you can only tell it by looking at it quite carefully. It's kind of an interesting thing, and it's right in the middle of a hill. That's what, of course, the tunnel was going under.
Well, terrific! I didn't know that about the tunnel for the trains from the North Shore over to the mainland. We'll call it Coquihalla. Lots of people on this side, the eastern side of the Rocky Mountains, have to go on the Coquihalla to get to the lower mainland of BC. And as we all know, just a couple of years ago, all those floods and everything closed it for a while. But in my recollection, it seemed to open quite quickly. How did they get those repairs done so fast, do you think?
Well, they were all temporary repairs that they did as a sort of an emergency thing. Like most of them were single lane bridges, but yeah, they did a remarkable job in connecting it up so quick. But of course, it's a very important route, so I guess there was an economic incentive to do so. The bridges along the river west of Merritt were completely, like, the road just completely disappeared. So it wasn't a matter of just the bridges; it was the road as well. And but they did a remarkable job. I had to sort of revise the book at the last minute because it was approaching completion when this all happened, right? And of course I had to include that. How could I not? And so I managed to get some photographs from the BC Ministry of Transportation that were quite good ones, and include those in the book. So there's a little section on the destruction of bridges on the Coquihalla. which was originally built in 1986, if you may recall, for it just in time for Expo 86 in Vancouver.
Right, and it had a toll on it when it first opened. They said it would be paid off, I think, in 25 years, and I was living out there at the time, and I said, oh, that'll never happen. And lo and behold, it actually worked. It got paid off, apparently, so there you go.
Yeah, well, that was a political thing, of course, but, I mean, it's just like the tolls were taken off on the Port Mann and the Golden Ears Bridge across the Fraser in Vancouver as a result of the new government in 2016, I think it was. That was one of the sort of ways politicians get elected. It's promising things like taking tolls off of bridges.
Right, when it was due to come off anyway. So, speaking of tunnels, that's part of the title. It's Incredible Crossings, the history and art of the bridges, tunnels, and ferries of British Columbia that connect British Columbia. And sticking onto the West Coast, Lower Mainland again, I grew up in the Crescent Beach, White Rock area. Remember the Dees Island Tunnel, we called it then, opening. And is there any plans to make that any better than it is now? Because I don't think it's gotten any bigger since 1959.
No, that's right. It opened in 1959, and it is a major bottleneck. I think it's thought to be the worst bottleneck in Canada, actually, at the moment. There were plans for a new tunnel, and then and they changed started widening the highway either side of it, and then they changed it to a bridge, and that's the current plan. Apparently, there's a conceptual view of the bridge that's supposed to go there in the book, but it still won't be ready, so I understand, until about 2030. So there's going to be an awful lot of congestion until that time. The tunnel is a very interesting structure because it was built by what was then an innovative method of basically sinking. They pre-built tubes on the banks of the river, and then hauled them out or pushed them out into the river and sank them, and then sealed them all together and pumped the water out of it. So and then dumped a lot of sand and stuff on top of it. So it was a sort of a quick way, if you like, or a easier way of creating a tunnel in that location. It was one that had been first used in Europe in the Maas Tunnel in Rotterdam. The River Maas had been built that way. A tunnel had been completed in 1944 during the war, and a local MLA whose name was George Massey was the guy who promoted it considerably, and there's photographs in the book of him showing how it would improve the communications and so on. And of course, the tunnel is now called the Massey Tunnel. So he couldn't have probably foreseen the amount of growth that has taken place south of the river since that time. Certainly, if that tunnel had not been there, pretty much all of Delta would not have developed the way it has.
Exactly. And we're also talking about bridges, tunnels, and ferries all across British Columbia, which leads me to ask about is it the Crow's Nest Pass Tunnel, that railroad tunnel west of Calgary, and that takes trains, through to the Revelstoke area, or Golden, BC? Is that mentioned?
Oh, you're probably... Yeah, you're probably referring to the spiral tunnels, are you?
Yes. That must have been a major feat.
That's Canadian on the Canadian Pacific line, and was built in 1909, and was a way of reducing the grade from what was there previously when the CPR had been built originally in that location in 1884-85. They created something called the Big Hill, which was a stretch of railway line that was at 4 point something percent grade, which is basically double what is normally allowed or normally thought correct for a mainline railway. And they wanted to get rid of it, and the only way they could think of, or the engineer involved could think of it, was to create these spiral tunnels that lengthen the distance enough to reduce the grade, and they still operate today just the way they used to. And that was modeled on a similar spiral tunnel called the Gotthard Tunnel, which was in Switzerland, and it, again, but from 1880 something, that so quite a bit before. So these ideas were borrowed and applied in Canada from Europe. And but there's famous photos of that, and there's one in the book of a train, like with the part of the train above the locomotive of the train coming out of the tunnel, where you get both parts, because they have such long trains that you can do that.
We also have pictures all throughout the book of lots of different ferry boats, and there's one picture you have, I think it's on page, I think I've lost it, 149 maybe, let me see. Well, no, it's a ferry, Lillooet ferry. It's like a cable type ferry. Is that still in operation?
Oh, yeah. I mean, cable ferries are the most common type of ferry that still exists across rivers, short distances across rivers. One of the interesting types, though, you get on the Fraser River in one or two locations, including near Lillooet, is the so-called reaction ferry, which is uses the power of the current, which is quite strong at these points, to propel the ferry across the river. And it does that by simply keeping it at an angle that allows it to push the ferry laterally across the river while it's being held in position, so it can't go floating downstream by a cable. And that's a very green way of using transportation, I guess. You can actually use the river, power of the river itself.
Of course, British Columbia being riddled with rivers and lakes, and have to use ferries to get to the island from the mainland. And it says here that there were once 5 covered bridges in BC, and one is still left today. Where is that one?
Well, it's actually a partially covered one. It's just the sides are covered, but not the top, and that's in Keramios, in the southern end of the Okanagan in BC. And it was originally built as a railway bridge by the Great Northern Railway that was trying to, I actually end up building as far as Princeton, which is just the other side of the Hope Mountains from Hope, BC, and they proposed to have a big tunnel through the Hope Mountains, 13-mile long tunnel that never materialized because this was 1913 when basically the economy was going to collapse the next year with the start of the First World War, because so many settlers left. But it was an attempt, like the railway ran from the U.S. into Canada, and there's lots of examples in southern BC of railways being built by U.S. companies, particularly the Great Northern, that were designed to tap the mineral wealth of BC. The problem with BC in this location is all the mountain ranges are north and south, and so are the lakes. So that to travel from east to west is quite difficult, but to travel north to south is relatively easy. And of course, the U.S. was south of here, so it was easier to take things to the U.S. than it was to bring them to the coast here. And this was one of those railways.
Gotcha, and that brings me to my next question about the photographs. You took lots of pictures on your own for this work, the Incredible Crossings work, so you must have traveled up and down and across British Columbia quite extensively for this work.
Yeah, I did. I mean, certain ones you have to visit, and they're all over the place. And BC is a big province, so yeah. But most of the color photographs in the book are my own, and some black and white. Like, I mean, there's various quote artistic unquote things that have been done to photographs to make them artistically more interesting. Like one of my favorites is the use of a fisheye lens, which is a lens that creates a round image that takes in a 180-degree view up and down as well as from side to side. So it produces some very interesting results when you start taking pictures inside trestle bridges and stuff like that, because it sees such a wide angle. But there's also ones that are converted to black and white, because in some cases black and white emphasizes the lines and the curves better than if it's got color, which can be distracting in some circumstances. And there are various other photographic techniques or photographic processing techniques that I've used just for one or two photos in the book.
And the ones I'm looking at right now are the I'll call it the Mud Bay Trestle, because I've walked on that trestle years ago, so being near Crescent Beach, so I know all about it. But the wooden one has been replaced, right?
Yes, I mean, this was one of the sort of objectives that I had doing this book, was to document bridges that were, I thought, about to be replaced, because the modern technology allows a much more efficient, I suppose, bridge, in the sense that it's like tends to be a flat beam made with concrete and steel, and but is a lot less interesting as far as a viewer might consider. So I've tried to document a number of the wooden trestle bridges that are disappeared, and indeed there's one at the beginning of the book which was in the process of being disappeared, so as to speak, in that there was a concrete flat bridge being built right beside it over the Chehalis River in Harrison, BC, so I could see what was going on, in real time, and it was all being replaced with steel made in China.
Of course. Incredible Crossings is the book, and it deserves a place in everyone's home, whether you're a traveler and likes the bridges, tunnels, and ferries, or you're just interested in one or the other, or you've been on many of these, you need to get it. Incredible Crossings, The History and Art of the Bridges, Tunnels, and Ferries by Derek Hayes. It's from Harbour Publishing in Vancouver, and, well, it says near Madeira Park, BC. So that's, I think, on the island, Harbour Publishing.
Sunshine Coast.
Sunshine Coast. Oh, I got you. Yep, up that way. Well, see, I don't know anything anymore. I've got too old. One quick question before we go is, do you have a favorite bridge, or at least a favorite bridge picture that you took in this book?
Yeah, well, I suppose my favorite would be the Alex Fraser Bridge, which is a cable-stayed bridge that was built over the Fraser in 1986, and it's got. I drove across the bridge with a fisheye lens pointing vertically out of the sunroof of my car in order to get some of these pictures, and the results are kind of interesting, if nothing else. The lines and the curves have been emphasized, and it produces a very interesting result. So I think that would certainly be my favorite.
And that's Derek Hayes. What are you working on next before we leave you?
Oh, well, as I mentioned, the book on high-speed trains, I guess.
Mm-hmm. All right. Okay, we'll wait to see that one. Derek Hayes, thank you very much for being with us today, and I encourage everyone to go look for Incredible Crossings, The History and Art of the Bridges, Tunnels, and Ferries of British Columbia by Derek Hayes. Thank you very much, sir.
Thank you, Dennis, very much.
Thank you for visiting with us today. This is Talking Books and Stuff with Dennis Rimmer. Contact him at dennis@talkingbooks.tk. Thank you, and may all the good news be yours. Oh, and don't forget to check out his book, The Great Canadian Notebook, available across Canada and at amazon.ca.